as Jared said, my name is Laura Godden. I'm an archivist at the University of Wisconsin-La Crosse in Murphy Library in the Special Collections and Area Research Center. I'm excited to be here talking about the census records tonight because it is such a timely topic. I think originally I was scheduled to give this talk right around the time of the 2020 census, but that got canceled because of COVID. But it just happened that we had another big census date coming up, and now it's safer to see each other. So I appreciate you all coming and joining me here. So that's my work. Let's see. That's our reading room. More hands. And so, yeah, if you haven't been if you're into genealogy and you haven't been here yet, and you have local ancestors, you maybe should think about coming by and checking it out. Sometimes people think that only students are welcome there, but we welcome members of the community too. And we have all sorts of local history materials, primary sources, archival collections, that sort of thing. Kind of the stuff you think about when you think about an archive, old maps, newspaper articles, letters, diaries, photographs, that sort of thing. And we're also affiliated with the Wisconsin Historical Society. We're part of a network of archives throughout the state called Area Research Centers. And basically what the Historical Society tried to do in the 1960s was get records from the areas they were created back in those areas, figuring they'd be more convenient for people, and they could use them more, and they get used more. And the Wisconsin Historical Society liked it because it freed up a little space too. And we like it because then you don't have to drive all the way to Madison. And so we hold records for a 5-county area: La Crosse, Monroe, Vernon, Jackson, and Trempealeau. And we have stuff like vital records, naturalizations, tax rolls, that sort of thing. But we're here today to talk about the census. This in my pocket. Oops. Oh, that was a bad plan. All right, there's a reason that I work in the archives. It's because me and technology don't always get along, and this is why I always print out my notes, because I do not trust the computer. But anyway, so I've been working at Murphy Library for about 10 years. I started doing the genealogy just because I think I was assigned to do it in like a high school or middle school class, and I just kind of became interested in it. And, see, technology and I. So I've been working on it for a long time. As genealogists know, it's always a work in progress and you're never done. But the census records are one of the first places I started, and I keep coming back to them and finding new things. So I think that these are very important records, just because they're a good place to start, and you can keep coming back to them and finding new things. And every 10 years, you get a new set of records to look through. So that's, I think, pretty excellent. All right. Yeah, so if you don't, see, maybe I should have taken you up on that podium. I thought I could do this with 2 hands, but hopefully everyone knows what a census is, and hopefully everyone recently participated in the 2020 census. If you don't know, it's basically just a periodic count of the number of people in the country. It's actually mandated by the Constitution, and basically they're just counting up people so they know how to divide up our representational government, so how many Congress people each state gets. So every 10 years, things get redistricted based on population and where people are moving and that sort of thing. And so it was created for a kind of a, not so, you know, I'm like, did I do something to make this happen? All right. You know, it seemed, you know, it's very logical, and it's very cool that we have these records, and it just so happens that they're very useful for genealogists. Let's see. So I don't know. I always think it's interesting that, like, I think the genealogists are the people that I know that get most excited about the census, but they weren't really created with genealogists in mind at all. So this is an early census record, and the early ones, you can see they really were just focused on counting up the number of people And so only the heads of household are listed here, and then everybody else that's in the household is just listed as a tally mark. And so, you can find out things like, gender, and on this one, race, you can kind of figure out what people's races are. But it's just not very robust. But there's still like helpful stuff that you can gather from this. But sometimes these are very difficult records. So one of my ancestor family names, their last name is Ayler, and I'm like, I've been looking for a Jacob Ayler, and I'm like, is this him? But unfortunately, because only his name is listed, I can't see what the name of his wife is or the name of his kids is, so I can't really confirm if that's the right Jacob Ayler or not. And so that it can be very frustrating too, because you might have a couple different options. And then you have to go to different records to figure out if you have the right person, and hopefully you can find that information out some other way. So it's kind of nice that over the years they started adding more questions to the census and giving us more information. Again, not with genealogists in mind, but we get to benefit from that. So some people don't realize that you're actually legally required to participate in the census because it is so important to our democracy and important for redistricting. And I mentioned that they started asking more questions, and not for genealogists. And the reason the government started kind of doing that is that they figured as long as they're putting in all this effort and doing all this, they could gather other data and information that would help them. And so the government was thinking about ways to find information to where to have government programs at, where to send funding to, and that sort of thing. And so, like when the census came out in 2020, there was a big push and a lot of people pushing to say, you should fill this out, you should fill this out, you should fill this out. And the reason that it is like today's census is tied to $675 billion in annual federal funds. So they use that data to divide up that money, and that's a lot of money. And so if your area is undercounted, you're not getting as many federal funds as you're eligible for, and that's one reason that people are so gung-ho about trying to get people to fill out their census. But as you know, for 2020, not everyone was very excited about filling it out. So I thought that cartoon was a little funny. All right. So I mentioned that the census records have changed every year. So like the ones from 1890 to 1840, basically you only get that head of household, that tally thing. But when 1850 starts and after that, things start getting a little bit more exciting. And I like this, sort of little timeline, thinking about things that I never would have thought of before, because like 1950, they started counting people that live abroad. And I'm like, oh yeah, how would they have done that before then? And would they have thought to count them? And would they thought that was important? And I'm like, oh, and then it's just, before 1950, those people just didn't get counted. And so it's an imperfect system, and we're going to talk more about some of the imperfectness of census records. But I think it's kind of part of their charm too. It keeps life interesting. I think genealogy is a bit like being a history detective. I think there's a reason that there's a PBS show called that. And it's also interesting to think about how the data collection has changed over time. So before 1970, they didn't mail out a questionnaire to people's houses. They had someone actually come to your door and ask you questions, and they wrote it down for you. And as the population got bigger and as technology changed and different ideas came along, they found different ways to do it. And I think one thing that was interesting about the 2020 census is that was the first time you could do everything completely online. And it's like, wow, we think that we're so technologically advanced nowadays, but we've had the internet for a long time, but it took till 2020 to kind of make that happen. So if you know your U.S. history, you know that because the census is mandated by the Constitution, and the Constitution came into effect 1790 after the failure of the Articles of Confederation. So the first census, 1790. That makes sense. The most recent census I've mentioned a few times is 2020. And every 10 years, they take a census. But That doesn't mean you'll have access to all of them, because unfortunately, sometimes bad things happen. Like, I don't know if you know this, in the 1890 census, good luck with that. It burned out, burnt. And there was a fire in 1921, and those records were lost. And so if you're a genealogist looking for those records, a few of them survived, but not very many. So you probably just won't find any for that year. So that's very sad for all us archives people and genealogists. But it still befuddles me that they only had one copy, and once that copy was gone, that was it. But nowadays, they take a lot more precautions to make sure that these sort of things don't happen. And one interesting thing, like some of the early census records, they used to let people just take them home in certain cases. And this is like the very, very early ones. And so some of those were just lost like in the 1800s, and no one knows where they went. They're probably in someone's basement somewhere, or somebody's descendants like, what's this junk, and threw them away. We just don't know. Let's see what I was going to say. So finding records that exist aren't the only challenge with that. It's every year that comes out, it gets more and more challenging, or not challenging, but takes longer, to make it through all the records because our population keeps growing. But now that they're using volunteers to index the census as they come out, it actually speeds up the process. So even though there's more people to count, because so many more people are working on it and indexing it, they can actually index things pretty quickly. The 1940 census that came out 10 years ago, I think they thought it was going to take 6 months, and the indexers were so gung-ho it only took them 4 months. And so hopefully there'll be a similar excitement to index this one too, and that's cool to know that the Monroe County Local History Room is working with Family Search to do that. And so if you're interested in doing that, talk to Hannah. It's like, it's hard to believe that tomorrow you could start doing that. And so you might be wondering, why did they wait 72 years to release the census? And that's basically for privacy reasons. So they want people to fill out their census and fill it out honestly and with the right information, and they want people to feel like their information is protected. And for that reason, like the Census Bureau says, they'll never release your information. But the caveat is that these records end up with the National Archives and Records Administration, who release them after 72 years. And that's kind of like the average lifespan of the individual. So, and most people aren't like a baby when the census comes out. So the idea is most people will be very elderly or deceased, and so therefore their information being out there won't be so sensitive for privacy reasons. And also it was so long ago, that information again is a lot less sensitive. So that's why they wait 72 years. So, this is the 1950 census form. So the form is out there, even though they haven't released the records yet. And if you ever want to download the blank forms just to see which is, what's on each census, there are plenty of places on the internet that you can do that from. You can do it directly from the National Archives and Records Administration site, and also a whole bunch of genealogy sites have them out there. And you can just see how much more robust this 1950 census is compared to the early one I showed you from, I think it was 1840. I've already forgotten because I have a goldfish memory. One interesting thing that people note about this one is that it's green, but probably when you see the copies online, I heard that they're microfilmed in black and white, so you won't actually see the green, so don't get your hopes up on that. But all the information will be there, so that is important. And one other interesting thing about the 1940 and the 1950 census is that they'd randomly ask a couple people on the line some supplemental questions, so you can kind of see there's like special spots, and then those supplemental questions will be at the bottom. And so if you're super lucky, your relative got picked, and you'll find out some extra information about them. So census records are a broad category of different sorts of records. And so when genealogists talk about census records, most of the time they're talking about population schedules, but there's also other schedules too that collect information. And Jared mentioned, like, yeah, there's some census, like, statistical data out there, but what genealogists usually want is the information about the people in the household. And so those are called population schedules. And really, if you've delved into, researching people in the 1800s, this is one of the best surviving pieces of evidence that are out there. And I mentioned they're a great starting point for genealogy, because if you start building your family tree or your pedigree chart, you start to figure out those relationships and, like who, fathers, mothers, brothers, sisters, siblings, that sort of thing. If they live together, a lot of times they're listed in the census record. And you can also figure out ages. And then once you have that kind of base genealogy down, then you can move on and find out other more detailed information. So even though like the forms vary a lot from year to year, after 1850, you can usually depend on finding things about a person's age, gender, race, occupation, where they were born, that sort of thing. So, as I mentioned, I just keep coming back to these because I keep finding out new things. So, like, my great-grandmother kind of was a single parent in the 1930s, and she also worked full-time. And I always wondered, how did she deal with like having kids that were 5 to 10 years old and working full-time, and manage that? And one thing that people recommend when you do the census records is not just to look for the person that you're seeking at that moment, but to look on the pages before and after. And so, let's see if I can make this work. So yeah, this is for my great-grandma up here, and these are all her kids, and so you can see she's the head of the household. And then, if I just went back one page, and so I learned just a few doors down, her in-laws lived there. And I'm like, oh, well that probably gives me some really good insight into what her life must have been like, that she probably interacted with her grandparents quite a bit when she was a kid, especially when her mom was at work. And it's just like those little details that you find, you can't be certain because, these records don't talk to you like that, but if they only lived 3 doors down, you could only imagine that they probably interacted quite a bit together, especially if she was trying to raise 3 young kids by herself. Another reason that like looking at the neighbors next to the people I was looking at in the census was very helpful, and this was a total accident, is I had a whole box full of family photos, and they're labeled with people's names, but there's nobody in there that I could figure out that I was related to. And I kept expanding my chart, and I'm like, what are these, like 3rd, 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th cousins? What are these, 10 times removed? I was trying to figure out who these people were. And I have this huge family tree, and I still can't find any of these people. Well, one day I was looking at the census records, and I'm like, oh. And I came across kind of a unique name, I'm like, wait a minute, I know that name. And I go get the box of photos, and like, sure enough. And I start looking through all the photos and looking at the census pages, and all the names are matching up with the photographs. And I was like, oh my gosh, they had a whole bunch of their neighbors' pictures, for whatever reason. I'm like, this makes so much more sense, and it relieved a lot of frustration because I couldn't find those 10 cousins 10 times removed or whatever they were. It turned out they weren't related at all. So that is another bonus thing, and it's just because when I do this sort of thing, like a lot of times, sometimes people just take notes in a notebook or whatever, but I try to save the whole file, the whole page if I can, and I still print things out. I think this is my 10th mention of probably I don't like technology a lot. I also still like to print things out, and it kind of helps me keep organized, and it helps me come across those kind of serendipitous discoveries. And so going back to my great-grandmother, so the reason she became a single parent was kind of unknown for a while. She always told people she was a widow and that her husband died. But the census revealed otherwise, it turned out. So it turned out he ended up institutionalized in a mental institution. But she was obviously not too keen on sharing that, even into her old age. It turned out he lived until 1982, so definitely he wasn't a widow. But the census, usually points out those sort of things. And I might have done myself a disservice here and cut it off, but yeah, at the top of this, it said like La Crosse County Mental Institution, West Salem, so and then it says right here, inmate, and so you can kind of figure out why that person is there. But you'll also come across other things besides hospitals. You'll find sometimes people that are living with their employer. So like if they're like a live-in servant or a nanny, or like if they're drivers, they might live with like another family. You might find people like in a TV hospital, prison or jail comes up quite a bit. When in my line of work, I help people with their genealogy all the time. And the question I get is why. I found in the census my relative was in jail, and I want to know why. And I'm like, well, we can try to figure it out. Boarding houses, hotels, and military bases, things like that. So there's a lot of different reasons to find people living where you might not expect them. And you can kind of uncover some stories or solve some family mysteries, like what happened to your great-grandfather. I picked my great-grandma out because I knew her, and so she told me quite a few stories, but there's like a lot of stuff she wouldn't say, and so I find her to be a very interesting case. And I always was curious if she spoke German, and she was kind of coy about it, maybe because of World War I and World War II. And so she never really answered my question when I asked her that, but her mother died when she was very young, like 4 or 5, I can't remember exactly. And so I found her living with her grandmother after her mother died, and I looked at the census and found them again, and that's my grandma right there. That's her my great grandma and her grandma. But when you get down here at the end, I think I cut it off because again, me and computers and technology. But it says what language people speak, and so her grandmother spoke German, and just German's listed, and so she must have at least understood it. Again, if you can't get the answers from the people, or if those people are no longer with us, you can find out all sorts of interesting things. And even though like there's no question, if she speaks German, you're like, well, if that's the only adult in the household, and the other people that live there, are children, and then I think her uncle, but he's probably gone to work a lot, they had to communicate somehow. So she must have known at least a little. So I thought that was very interesting. And you can also, infer things about people's social status. Like, I was shocked to find out they had a servant. And but their house was just a little dinky house on Division Street. It wasn't a fancy big neighborhood. There wasn't other people around with servants. And so I only assume that it's because her grandma was, 70 years old, and here she is trying to raise a 10, a 9, a 7-year-old. She probably needed the help, and perhaps maybe their father paid for this person to be around the house and help out and clean up, because that'd be a lot of work for a 70-year-old woman in 1910 to take care of 3 children. And that's the only thing I can figure out. But again, I never heard this from her. It's something I never found out, but here's the record for it, and I know the person's name, and if I wanted to, I can even look in, to that person. I could look her up in the city directories, maybe see if she has an obituary, stuff like that, if I wanted to find out more about this person that lived with my great-grandmother when she was a little kid. Some some of the other census, some census records have information that also reveals stuff about socioeconomic status. So sometimes they ask what your yearly income is. Sometimes they ask what the value of your home is. Sometimes they ask if you own or rent your home. And sometimes if you own it, they'll ask if you own it free and clear or if you have a mortgage on it. And all those different things can give you some very valuable insight to how well off or not so well off your family was. And when you start printing these off and you have them every 10 years, you could see if things change over time, like maybe with the Great Depression, for example. You could see how that national huge event affected your family individually, and not just the whole country. And you can also, find out some, other stuff about national things that are going on. So like on this one, for example, so it says that the grandma was born in Germany, and here they're asking about people's naturalization status. And NA means naturalized, and AL should mean alien, and PA means papers filed. But instead she's got nothing. And being born in Germany, she should have something. And so when I first started doing genealogy, I started looking then into the naturalization records, and I found out that back then women didn't become naturalized by themselves. They either when their father, if they were a minor, when their father became naturalized, they were considered naturalized, or when their husband became naturalized, they were considered naturalized. And if you had the unfortunate luck of being an American-born citizen and marrying someone that wasn't naturalized, you as a woman would then lose your citizenship, and there's actually a process for repatriation if you need to do that later on. Yeah, and so I can only assume that because this is blank, like because she was a widow at this time and her husband had died, maybe she was just like some kind of nebulous citizen, non-citizen, or maybe she just didn't know the answer to the question, because like, well, I had citizenship through my husband, but when he passed away, does that mean I'm not a citizen? And the census taker is probably like, I don't know, lady, we'll just leave it blank. So that's one of the downfalls the downfalls of records like this is like, sometimes the information you get is only as good as the person collecting it. And so if the census taker wasn't trained to know the answer to that question, they might have wrote down the wrong thing or nothing at all, which can be a real bummer. Let's see. So I learned that my great-grandmother, her husband, before he went to the mental institution, worked in an auto parts factory. And when she became separated from him, we'll just say, she also went to work in the same auto parts factory to support her family. So I also thought that was pretty interesting. So you can like track people's employment over time too. So I think I've mentioned quite a few times now. Boy, this looked a lot better on my computer screen. How the information found on each census varies by year to year, and I can't memorize it, and you probably can't either. This is where the internet comes in very handy. I'm pretty sure I downloaded this from familysearch.com, but there's, again, a lot of genealogy websites have information like this, and they can create like a nice handy chart to let you know what's on each census. And so if you're like, oh, I want to know, I don't know, what was it? I know the marital status of someone, and then you can go to the thing and like, oh, I can look at any one of these censuses, so I find out when that person's alive, who I want to know the marital status for, and I can go to that census, and then you can also see if it changes over time between those years. And so something like that's really handy if you have like a burning question that you want to answer, or if you're like super thorough and go through every census, maybe you don't need something like that. But every once in a while, like I think of something new, and I decide, oh, I have to go back to the record, and it's kind of a good way to go get to that information quickly. Another thing I like about the census records is you never know what you'll find. Again, these are created by humans. Who knows what the person at the door says when this poor census taker asked for what this person's occupation was. But apparently the census taker did not want to argue and just wrote the answer down that this girl does what she pleases. Accurate. I think it says 15-year-old. Seems about right. 15-year-olds generally do what they please. And so, yeah, so even you can come across humorous and interesting things in there. I think that they're also really good if you're, ever interested in learning more about history, just to learn about what's going on at the time. So, like, let's see, this one from 1930. One of the questions on here is, does your family own a radio? This showed up so much better on my computer screen. But yeah, one of the questions is if they owned a radio. My family member did not, but someone just a couple doors down did, and so maybe they went over their house and listened to the radio. But you think about, why is the government asking that question? Well, they probably want to see how many citizens they could reach over radio, right? So if they had like important information to share with the citizenry, like, would radio be an effective form of communication? Like, what percentage of the population might we reach? So if only 50% of the population had a radio, you kind of know that it'd be around that, even if people went over to their neighbors' houses or whatever, because not everyone's going to listen. But, 90% of the population owned a radio, well, then you're probably hitting most people that do want to listen. And so that kind of information and data, might have played a role in why FDR had fireside chats over the radio. He might have seen census data and said, oh, that's enough people that I'm really going to reach, a large portion of the audience, or a large portion of the country listening in the audience to the radio program, versus if you didn't think you'd reach enough people, they might have to send something out by mail instead. And it's these little mundane decisions that the government makes that this kind of data really helps with. And then later, people like us get to benefit from it and say, oh, when did, oh, my poor great-grandma didn't have a radio, what a bummer. But at least the neighbor had one, so maybe she got to listen to it sometime. And so you go from like the macro level and the big level all the way down to the micro level. And it's like, how many other records can, really speak to so many different aspects of society? Because it's not just immigration, it's not just, your property and your tax rolls. It's so many different aspects of society. And because the questions change, you see kind of what was important at that time. And so when you start looking at the 1950 census, you're going to see a lot of questions on there about housing and employment, because it was after World War II, right? GIs were coming back home. People were concerned, like, what are all these guys going to do? Is there going to be enough jobs for everybody? There's also a housing shortage going on, right? And a baby boom is going to start. I don't know if people knew, and so that was a kind of the burning questions on people's minds. And so, yeah, when you go through the 1950 census, they're going to ask, like, are you living on a farm or a ranch? Is there 3 or more acres at the place you live? Because a lot of people are leaving rural areas and seeking out urban areas to find employment. And the supplemental questions, the ones that appear at the bottom, that they ask like a random small sampling of a smaller sampling of people, but it's still a lot of people they asked. Like, were you living in the same house a year ago? Were you living on a farm a year ago? Were you living in the same county a year ago? And then there's lots of questions about employment. How much time did you spend working? When were you last employed? Are you working for pay? And how much pay did you make? Like, how much money did you make from non-salary wages, sort of thing, like from dividends and interest, or collecting rent on a property you rent, that sort of thing. So they get very, very detailed, the questions. But then you think about the context of the time, and they're worried about the what's going to happen to the economy in the post-war period. You're like, oh, that makes a lot of sense. And so, yeah, like I said, there's just so much you can infer and learn about the country and about your relatives from them. So U.S. Federal censuses, I mentioned, are every 10 years, so years ending in 0. But they're not the only censuses out there. A lot of the states did censuses for a while. And that's because 10 years is a long time. And in the 1850s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, you could think about, oh, the population of Wisconsin was probably increasing quite rapidly. As it, gained its statehood, and 1848, Wisconsin became a state, right? It gained its statehood, and people started, coming from the, eastern part of the country and moving here. And so 10 years might have been too long, and that's why some states would do a state census in years ending in 5. I think the last state to do one was like in the 80s, and it was like Maryland or something. Don't quote me on that. Somewhere out east, but in Wisconsin, we have them up to 1905. Unfortunately, a lot of those state censuses only do the head of the household and the tally thing, but it still helps you track where people are. So there's still some benefit in that. And even before Wisconsin became a state, there were some territorial censuses, but they didn't do them, I don't know, they're kind of disorganized. I call it the Wild West of, when we want, what we want to ask. It's just like, it seems totally, they're hard to look through. A bunch of them are lost, but I don't know. You can still, if you're motivated enough, you can do that. So here's an example of Wisconsin state census. So you can see it's pretty similar to the federal one where they only did the tallies. Some other neat things you can gather from this, even though only the heads of household are listed. You might find out that your relative lived next to someone that's either nationally or locally famous. It's always surprising how many people from this area. Need a drink of water, sorry. Have come to some sort of national prominence, maybe they live next to George Pogue, who was the first African American to medal in the Olympics. Or maybe they live next to Joseph Losey, who was a director in Hollywood. So that's another cool thing that you can learn, because you never know who their neighbors might be. I had taught a class today, so I guess this is my voice is maximum. Oh yeah, I was going to say, and if you're ever searching for a relative in the census records and they're not coming up and you think, oh, maybe their name is misspelled or maybe they're indexed wrong, sometimes if you find out who their neighbor was and search for their neighbor, you can find your relative because they'll probably be on the same page. So knowing who live next to your relatives can be helpful for many reasons. Right. So this is the 1905 Wisconsin State Census. So this one has a lot more information. So I wish they were all would have been like this, but what are you going to do? So if you're wondering what censuses are available and what's out there, so if you're wondering about the state or the territorial ones, again, the internet is your friend. It's a good place to go. Places like Family Search will list all of them and then say where they are. And this is a very helpful graphic because it says if it's an ancestry, it'll say oh, there's a fee to use it, or it'll say Family Search and it's free to use, or it'll say you can just go and find some of the things you can find right on the National Archives and Records Administration pages. I'm going to talk about the enumeration district maps in a minute, and that's one thing that you can get directly from there. So a lot, it's great. These are online. They're digitized. I work in a place we have them on microfilm. If I want a census record, most of the time I go to the internet because it's easier. I can just type in the name. It's quicker. I can get a digital file, I can print one off, all at the same time. So I really like the convenience of computers and technology in that instance. However, like sometimes if you do want to like page through a neighborhood real quick, sometimes it is helpful to use the microfilm because you can scroll a lot faster whether you're waiting for each page to load. And we do have like old-timey indexes that are soundexes, and so it's called the soundex instead of an index because like the way that they work is like how the name, you pronounce the name, so it's like phonetic instead of spelling, because if anybody's worked with Census Records here, I'm guessing people have, spelling mistakes abound, so that's another way to go about things. And so there are other ways to work around if you can't find the person you're looking for. Like I said, searching for a neighbor sometimes works, or you could go back to the way that we used to do things before they're all on the internet, and you could just type in the name. So options. All right, so hopefully everyone's here super excited for the census coming out tomorrow. But as we know, it won't be indexed right away. And so, if you really want to find your relatives, you kind of have three options. You can wait the 4 to 6 months that'll hopefully take for it to all get indexed. One thing that's new about the release of this 1950 census is they're going to try using some OCR software and some artificial intelligence to like create a starting point for an index, but they haven't done this before, so no one's sure how good the computers and robots will do figuring out the names and how searchable it will be. Maybe it'll work pretty good right away, but again, if you've looked at census records in the past, you know the handwriting is sometimes very not so good, and so I don't know if the OCR is going to read it, but at least gives the people indexing it, the humans, something to start from, and so hopefully that'll speed up the indexing process. And then the other thing that you could do if you really are excited, you can find the enumeration district for your relative, and then you can there's links, you can go right to those pages. You have to look through the whole enumeration district, but you can kind of on the sides of them, you'll be able to see the address and hopefully get closer so you don't have to like do every single name. So there's a couple ways to do that. Ancestry site has one where you can type in an address and it'll tell you the enumeration district. And then there's also the stevemorse.org, and you can type in what you're looking for. So I typed in my great-grandmother's address because, like I said, she's kind of the theme of the day today. And then if you know the streets surrounding it, and it'll tell you what the district is. And that link will take you, once it's activated, it's not activated yet, but it will be in just a few hours. You click on that link and it'll take you to a real rural area. The best way to figure out what enumeration district you need to go to is to go to the maps. And so this is the one for La Crosse County, and you can just find it on the National Archives page, and you zoom in and it gets real clear, and I was able to find the person that I was, I'm not gonna look at everyone right away, but there are like 2 or 3 family members that I'm most interested in, so I'm excited to see there. So I'll probably look theirs up right away. Hopefully the excitement won't be too much for all the computer, I don't know how fast this website will be running tomorrow because a lot of people are trying to use it and get in. It might crash, or it might be really slow, so that happens. It does work, I guarantee it. I just used it today, it was working great. But yeah, if you go home right away and do it tonight, you can actually save the link, so you don't have to use the website. You can just save the link in another place. But I don't know. It's hard to say. I don't know how much traffic these websites can hold. We hope the National Archives can handle quite a bit of traffic. These maps do take a little bit to load because they're kind of big, but they're nice then because you can zoom in and see things. Well, I'm still not mastering this clicker. Anyway, so I talked about the population census schedules, but I'm going to go through these just super quick. Because, boy, you can really go down a rabbit hole when you do genealogy, right? And I'm like, I just feel like it's this fun thing. Yep, this has happened to me many times. Lost much sleep. So, even some of the non-population schedules do list people, so this is like a farming one. But so if if your relatives live on a farm and you were interested in knowing how much that farm was worth and what kind of animals they had and what kind of crops they grew and how much, for certain years you can look up those things because those censuses exist. So the Wisconsin ones for agriculture are not online, so I picked one from Minnesota instead, but they are on microfilm and you can request them. Like through interlibrary loan or our ARC network. I think I didn't mention that before, but the ARC network will actually ship materials back and forth to one another. And so the microfilm is at the Wisconsin Historical Society, and they'll send it to the La Crosse ARC, so people don't have to drive all the way to Madison, but they still have to use it in our library. They can't take it home. But not too many people have a microfilm machine at home, so that's usually not a problem with those records. So those are available for certain years for certain states. There was non-population schedules for the 1950 census. Unfortunately, none of those are going to be available like this because they weren't microfilm, and once the statistical data was gathered off them, they got rid of the records. And so we might never see those. Even though they had some really interesting things they did with the 1950 census, like for babies born within the first 3 years of 1950, they filled out a special index card for them, talking about where they were born and all that. But unfortunately, they did not survive over time because somebody decided they weren't needed, so that's kind of sad. There's mortality scheduled for people that died during the year, and so those will give you extra information on what they died of, but also repeat some information like where they were born or what their profession is, so that's something that you find on the census anyway. Industry schedule, so my ancestors were flour millers, so I found a flour. And so I thought that was kind of interesting, and just, but again, it shows the name of the company and how much flour they're producing. So because I don't know anything about flour, that information doesn't mean a lot to me, but it's like, oh, neat, flour. Veterans schedule, so if you have any relatives that were veterans, you could find what company they were in, if you haven't been able to find that in other sources, but there's quite a few sources for those, luckily. And then there's some non-population schedules that don't have personal information, like the social statistics schedule. It's how many libraries are there, and kind of stuff like that. I wish I could read that. See, I printed it off as real small in here, but one of the questions was how many libraries. That's what the 67 is. And then special dependent delinquent classes. So these censuses track people with different ailments. They kind of use pretty harsh language compared to what we use today. But one thing I found interesting is they're asking questions like, is that person able to take care of themselves, or do they need an attendant? Otherwise, it's a lot of these have repeated information on them, and so probably that's why a lot of times for certain years they weren't saved. But the earlier record I showed you of my great-grandfather, it just said he was an inmate at the mental hospital, but it didn't say why. But for this census, actually it lists what the person is suffering from. And then there are also slave censuses. I found one for Maryland and Baltimore. But it doesn't list the names of the people that were enslaved. It lists the owners. And then it tallies the number of slaves that they own. And so if a person owned a bunch of slaves, and you see something like this. And unfortunately, when you're African American, doing your genealogy can be quite complex. So anything that provides any clues to where your relatives might have lived is valuable, just because so little exists. All right. So I mentioned there's a lot of challenges, we'll call them, with the census records, and really the spelling thing is just huge. You think about the census and the census taker, and they're focused on trying to count the right number of people, and they might be out there all day, and there might be other things like language barriers, or maybe I don't know, the only person home is like a 12-year-old, so you're like, well, the 12-year-old can't spell either. Who knows? We just don't know. And there's a number of things that could have went wrong that could have ended up in spelling mistakes. But sometimes you can kind of figure out what happened. Yeah, so this one I mentioned, yeah, I've been, the relatives I've been showing all night, their last name's Ehler. It's O-E-H-L-E-R, but in German, that O-E noise, it kind of makes an A or an E noise, so you can see why they spelled it with an E there. So sometimes, you can sort of, figure out what happened. I don't know if they did that for all the German names, but sometimes things are just blatantly wrong. Like, this is Valentin Ehler, and they put his wife as Barbara, but his wife was, not Barbara at all. It was Pauline. It's not even close. And it's like, I wonder if they just asked the neighbor, and the neighbor's like, oh shoot, I can't remember that lady's name. Oh, I think it was Barbara. Yeah, I'm sure that down. Right? Barbara? Who's Barbara? Gottfried. It's spelled Gottfried. So it makes searching for things very difficult. But once you find them, one nice thing about these things being on the internet is you can kind of correct them, and then hopefully other people looking for the same people might be helped out by that. Yeah, and then sometimes not all your questions are answered, because I don't know who this guy is. Yeah. Schaefer, it's like a total different last name, and so sometimes they don't put how they're related to people, and you're like, oh, is that person related to me and related to my family, or were they a farmhand? And so it's like, well, I wish they would have asked that question on that year's census. And some years they did, and some years they did not. So you just kind of have to take what is given and go from there. And I do find it interesting that sometimes you can things get corrected over time. So the last one was the 1860 census, where their name was spelled wrong, and there was, I don't know, someone was Barbara by accident. But the very next census, their name was spelled correctly, and we're back to Pauline instead of Barbara, so that's good. Maybe they were home that day and they were able to get the names right. I mean, I can understand getting your marriage date or your anniversary wrong, but getting your wife's name wrong, not so good. Not so good. I don't know. When I think about people that go from house to house filling these things out, it makes me think about Seinfeld, the Low Talker, where he actually ends up wearing the pirate shirt, and just I don't want to be a pirate. So, I mean, there's all sorts of, communication issues that come up. And then even if a person communicates it perfectly, you have to depend on that person to have legible handwriting. And so, yeah, so it's not just language barriers, it's, maybe it was really windy that day, it was hard to write. Who knows what could have went wrong? Yeah, I do find it interesting that, if the person wasn't home, they just ask a neighbor and say, good enough. Where today, that doesn't really happen. And today, for the language barrier thing, you can do the census in a whole bunch of different languages. So things have changed and improved over time. And then there's also, I've heard plenty of reports about, census takers that were just bad at their jobs. When you have that many humans doing them, some of them are going to be incompetent, and some of them are going to do a great job. Just lack of ability to follow directions is a problem that has persisted throughout time. So from the 1790 census to probably the 2020, because even though people fill out their own, they probably still some people that did not follow directions and did it wrong. So you never know what's going to happen. Let's see. And yeah, sometimes it's just someone comes to the door and you're like, what year did you immigrate to this country? And you have to remember that. So it's just hard to remember all those things sometimes. And sometimes people are just not very cooperative for whatever reason, whether this poor lady, vanity, or non-cooperation, or maybe you're busy or just don't want to. And the problem with the census is you don't know who provided the information either. Like I would have known, like, you know, would have been interested in like, well, maybe that one lady's name went down as Barbara because the neighbor provided it. One nice thing about the 1940 census is they started putting an X behind the person that provided the information. And so if, so if you know that your relatives didn't answer that information about themselves, then you know that you should probably double check that to make sure that that's accurate. And now we have to deal with not only problems of that the census takers at the time made, but like, oh, what if someone messes up when they index it? And I'm not blaming anybody because that definitely could be a C. But unfortunately, I couldn't find my grandmother right away because instead of an O for Ayler, it's got put down as a C. But then I'm like, yeah, I could see how that had happened. And so you have to deal with those sort of things. But like I said, at least, you know, these online indexes, you can make a suggestion and update it right away. Or if that happened in like a paper or microfilm index, you're kind of just stuck with it. I think I mentioned some of my tips and suggestions throughout. Like I like printing out things. I like looking at the pages before and after my relatives. Not trusting the indexes entirely. So if someone doesn't come up, maybe looking for a neighbor, maybe trying a microfilm index, maybe try common misspellings, and if like it's a last name that's always misspelled, like if you're a Gunderson and sometimes it's Ian and sometimes it's Owen, and that's like if you had someone with a very unique first name, you could try, you can do wild character searches, like put an asterisk in where it goes, where that common misspelling is, and maybe just try starting with a person with a common first name. Like if your relative is Steve Smith, I'm so sorry, I feel bad for you. That's one thing I like, that's why I use the Ayler part of my family, because it is a more unique name. The other part of my family is Davidson, and that becomes very arduous for many, many reasons. But I often joke about putting a sign outside our door. I'm like, your last name, is Smith or Johnson. Oh boy, please, please put on your patient pants. This is going to take a while. But yeah, then you have problems like this, where like, oh my gosh, why did you name all your children John? Like, could you help me out here? But it's really exciting when you do find something like in those census records that lead you to discover something else. And so, if you find out that they lived on a military base and you didn't even know that person was in the military, and all of a sudden you're diving into records about veterans and maybe finding all sorts of things that you never knew before. And so, like, I always think of the census as just being like this just rich place for clues, and like where you can just mine these clues. And I think about it like home improvement. I think it was like genealogy improvement, like family tree improvement. It's like you get all the things that you think you need for your plumbing project, and sure enough you start and you're like, oh, I have to go back to Menards. And it happens every time, right? Or, I forgot something, or something broke, I need something else, I'm gonna have to go. And then if it's a big project, you end up going like 4 or 5 times. That's how I feel like the census records are. But hopefully it's more fun than home improvement. I kind of like home improvement, so I can't even really say that. So, because I never get tired of looking at them, and it is exciting when new ones come out. And despite issues with handwriting and mistakes and different problems like that, sometimes you find a lady that says that she does what she pleases, and that just makes her whole day.